People outside the Midwest usually have two completely different opinions about St. Louis. Some think it's one of the most underrated, affordable cities in America. Others hear the crime statistics and immediately cross it off their list. But the reality of living here in 2026 is a lot more complicated than either side wants to admit. Because the truth is, some people move to St. Louis and absolutely love the lower cost of living, the food scene, and the slower pace of life. Meanwhile, other people leave within a year because they picked the wrong neighborhood, underestimated the weather, or expected the city to feel completely different from what they saw online. And that's exactly why this video matters. Today, we're breaking down two major pros and two major cons of living in St. Louis in 2026, so you can decide if this city is actually the right fit for your lifestyle before making a move. And real quick, if you're thinking about relocating anywhere in Missouri or around the Midwest, make sure to subscribe because these are the kind of details most relocation videos never tell you. The biggest reason people continue moving to St. Louis in 2026 is simple. Your money still goes a lot further here than it does in most major cities across the country. And for a lot of newcomers, that difference feels shocking almost immediately. People moving from places like Chicago, Denver, or Austin often realize they can rent a much larger apartment, buy a home sooner, or simply live with way less financial stress than they're used to. In many parts of St. Louis, housing prices are still dramatically lower than the national average, especially compared to coastal cities where even basic starter homes have become almost impossible for average buyers. And it's not just housing. One thing people constantly mention after relocating here is how much cheaper everyday life is. Parking is easier, restaurants are more affordable, utility bills, groceries, entertainment, and even insurance costs can feel noticeably lower depending on where you're moving from. That lower cost of living creates something a lot of people haven't experienced in years: breathing room. Instead of spending nearly every paycheck trying to survive, many residents finally feel like they can actually enjoy life a little more. Maybe that means traveling more often. Maybe it means buying a house with a backyard instead of renting a tiny apartment. Or maybe it just means not constantly stressing about money every single month. And honestly, that lifestyle change is a huge reason some people end up loving St. Louis far more than they expected to. But there's also another side to this conversation that relocation videos sometimes avoid talking about, because affordability is absolutely one of the city's biggest strengths. Where you choose to live inside the St. Louis area matters more here than almost anywhere else. And if you don't understand that before moving here, it can completely change your experience living in the city. Now, this is the part of the conversation that almost every person researching St. Louis eventually runs into: crime. And honestly, this is also where a lot of relocation videos either become overly dramatic or completely misleading. Because yes, St. Louis has struggled with crime for years, and nationally, the city statistics have given it a reputation that scares a lot of potential newcomers away. But what surprises most people after moving here is how different the experience can feel depending entirely on where you live. In St. Louis, neighborhoods matter more than almost anything else. Two areas just 15 or 20 minutes apart can feel like completely different worlds. One neighbor may feel quiet, family-oriented, and highly desirable, while another area nearby may struggle with serious crime, vacant properties, and economic decline. That's why people who move here without researching specific neighborhoods sometimes end up having a completely different experience than they expected. And this is also where newcomers get confused by the statistics. A lot of the national headlines focus on the city limits themselves, but the overall metro area includes many suburbs and surrounding communities that feel dramatically different from downtown St. Louis. Areas like Chesterfield, St. Charles, or O'Fallon often attract families and professionals specifically because they offer a quieter suburban lifestyle while still being connected to the larger metro area. At the same time, there are parts of the city where residents deal with real challenges involving crime, poverty, and underinvestment. Ignoring those realities wouldn't be honest either, but one mistake people make is assuming the entire St. Louis region feels dangerous everywhere all the time. Most locals will tell you that isn't true at all. Instead, they'll usually say the same thing: if you learn the area, research neighborhoods carefully, and understand where you're moving, your experience can be completely different from the image many outsiders have in their heads. And honestly, that learning curve catches some newcomers off guard. Someone relocating from a smaller town or a more uniform city may not realize how block by block certain parts of St. Louis can feel. That's why locals constantly recommend visiting in person before signing a lease or buying a home, because in this city, choosing the right area can completely shape your quality of life. And interestingly, once people settle into the neighborhoods that fit their lifestyle, many of them start discovering something they never expected about St. Louis that keeps them here long term: the culture. One thing that surprises a lot of people after moving to St. Louis is how much personality the city actually has once you start exploring it. Because on the surface, some outsiders assume St. Louis is just another quiet Midwest city. But once people live here for a while, they start realizing the culture is a huge part of why residents become so loyal to the area. And honestly, the food scene alone catches many newcomers completely off guard. St. Louis has an incredibly strong local food culture with everything from barbecue and Italian restaurants to local staples people here defend passionately. Neighborhoods like the Hill have become famous for Italian food, while local spots across the metro area give the city a much more unique identity than many people expect before moving here. And compared to larger cities, you can still enjoy great restaurants without feeling like every night out destroys your budget. Then there's the sports culture. Even people who aren't huge sports fans quickly notice how connected the city feels around teams like the St. Louis Cardinals and the St. Louis Blues. Game days create an energy that brings people together in a way that makes the city feel surprisingly tight-knit. And beyond sports, St. Louis also offers something many major cities don't anymore: genuinely good free attractions. Places like Forest Park, the zoo, museums, festivals, and outdoor events give residents a lot to do without constantly spending money. For families especially, that becomes a huge quality of life advantage. But honestly, what many transplants end up loving most isn't one specific attraction, it's the overall lifestyle. People often describe St. Louis as a place where life can feel more manageable. Traffic usually isn't as overwhelming as larger metro areas. People tend to be more approachable, and there's a strong sense of local pride that slowly grows on a lot of newcomers over time. That doesn't mean the city is perfect, but for many residents, the combination of affordability, entertainment, food, and community creates a lifestyle that feels much more balanced than what they left behind. Of course, there are still a couple of realities about living here that can become frustrating for some people long term, and one of them affects almost everybody eventually. Now, even people who love living in St. Louis will usually admit there are a few things that can wear on you over time, and one of the biggest is definitely the weather. If you've never lived in the Midwest before, the seasonal extremes here can be a real adjustment. Summers in St. Louis are hot, humid, and sometimes feel exhausting, especially during long stretches where temperatures stay high and dry day after day. Then on the other side of the year, winters can spring unpredictably between mild days and sudden snow or ice storms. And because the region sits in an area that experiences intense weather shifts, storms can become a serious factor too. Heavy rain, strong thunderstorms, tornado warnings, and rapid temperature changes are all a part of life here at different times throughout the year. For some people, it's no big deal. For others, especially newcomers from milder climates, it becomes one of the hardest parts of adjusting to life in St. Louis. The other major factor people sometimes underestimate is transportation. St. Louis is still very car dependent in most areas. While there is public transportation available here, most residents rely heavily on driving for work, shopping, and everyday life. And depending on where you live in the metro area, commuting without a vehicle can become difficult pretty quickly. So if you're moving from a city with extensive walkability or major public transit systems, that lifestyle adjustment can feel frustrating at first. But with all of that said, here's the reality. A lot of people who move to St. Louis in 2026 still end up feeling like the trade-offs are worth it. Because despite the weather challenges, neighborhood differences, and transportation limitations, the city continues offering something many Americans are struggling to find right now: affordability combined with a strong sense of community and quality of life. For families trying to escape extremely high housing costs, for remote workers looking for more space, or for people simply wanting a slower and more financially manageable lifestyle, St. Louis can honestly be a very attractive option. But at the same time, this city probably won't be the perfect fit for everyone. If you want year-round warm weather, highly walkable neighborhoods everywhere, or a city that feels polished and uniform across the entire metro area, you might end up disappointed here. But if you research carefully, choose the right neighborhood, and understand both the pros and cons before moving, St. Louis might end up surprising you in a very good way. And if you enjoyed this video and want more honest relocation content about Missouri and cities across the Midwest, make sure to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and let me know in the comments where you're thinking about moving next.